viewers of this channel, or possibly casual viewers of this channel, know that I love Raven Kenndey's Plated Prisoner series. I mentioned it first in the best books of 2020, where I read book number 1, Gild, and all of the Plated Prisoners books since then have made it into my notable best books of the quarter, just depending on where they landed. And I actually did a reading vlog when I read the 3rd book last year, and it's one of the most watched videos on this channel. The 4th book in the series, Glow, is coming out June 18th, and I wanted to do a reread of the first 4 books before it released so that I could be caught up and reminded of all the important plot moments. These books are not small books though, guys. The first one's 402 pages, the next one is 418, and the 3rd book makes a huge jump into 681 pages. A lot of reading to do just to be caught up and ready for book number 4. So I thought I would bring you guys a quick up-to-date summary reminder of where we are so you guys can just jump into Glow without reading all the series again. Major spoilers on this, guys. We are going to talk about some more mundane things like whether or not these books were popular on BookTube, who read them, whether or not they're in the right categories, all that kind of fun stuff. But we'll also be talking beat per beat about different plot points, character motivations, and reveals. Most of you guys know I don't care about spoilers. It's all about the journey. But this is one of the few series I would say that going in blind or going in spoiler free actually enhances the read. And there's this ongoing like puzzle piece kind of mystery feel going on where my brain was always working trying to figure out like how much of the information I was being given was accurate, what was Oren hiding from me, if anything, who were the major power players and how did they come together. Brain working on those pieces and putting it together was part of what I really liked about the series, and if you already know it all, that's not a lot of fun. Diving into book number 1, Gild. On Goodreads, this is sitting at a 3.67 star rating with 47,475 ratings and 4,891 reviews. So a lot of people have read this book. It's also one of those books that's more regularly reviewed on BookTube, so I have seen a lot of reading vlogs, reviews, and discussions around Gild specifically, even though I've seen a lot less about book 2 and 3. Generally speaking, it seems like the BookTube community does not like this book. I understand where some of the hesitation comes from. There is a lot of trigger warnings in this book. There's a lot of like gratuitous graphic scenes going on, and some of it feels like it's a little bit there just for shock value, like it's not fully realized or dealt with or handled in a particularly careful or delicate way. So if you have sensitivity to those elements, or if you are concerned about certain ways that we portray assault, this might be an issue. Me personally, I had a little bit less issue with some of these assault and violent situations than other booktubers did, possibly because it was a fantasy story and it was taking place in a world that like is pretty removed from our world. It's very loosely based on like a fairy tale medieval kind of setting, and to me some of like the consistency of the assault and the abuse that was happening, like if this sort of thing was coming up all the time in your life and it was happening over and over again, you would kind of numb out to it and you would kind of just accept that this is part of your reality and something you'd have to deal with moving forward. So even though the characters don't necessarily deal with things in healthy ways or give like a full weight to the situations at hand, I sort of understood why. And also, like, I don't always want my characters dealing with things the right way or in a neat, clean way. Sometimes I want them to deal with things in a flawed, messed up, complicated kind of way. And for me, this story is giving that. Another thing I noticed about booktubers who are reviewing Gild Book 1 is a lot of them are in the romance category, and Gild is not a romance. So far, books 1, 2, and 3 in the Plated Prisoner series is not a romance. And I don't think this book series is meant to be romantic. I think it's meant to be like an epic fantasy adventure. And the Plated Prisoner series is really different than other book series that Raven Kenndey has put out in the past. I read her series Void, which is obviously supposed to be a reverse harem bully romance with paranormal elements. I have considered reading the Heart Hassle series, which is about like a reverse harem Cupid series going on. Like all of these sort sort of stories have magic, paranormal, a little bit of that epic adventure, but are mostly like romance focused. So to start with, I think this series had the wrong audience looking at it. Raven Kennedy's done her best to get it in front of the right audience. For categories, Gild is in sword and sorcery fantasy ebooks, Greco-Roman myth and legend fantasy ebooks, and epic fantasy. And all of these are more appropriate than like a romance category of any kind. I originally described Gild as like kind of a slow burn, and I think part of the reason I felt that way the first time I read it is because I was looking at it from a romantic perspective and looking at Oren, our lead, and Midas, our romantic interest, and thinking like,
oh, this makes me really uncomfortable. I don't want them to be together, and I don't know why Oren likes him.
And because we were so focused on like this Oren-Midas relationship that I didn't really want to happen, I was actually feeling like the prose itself were moving very slowly. But when I reread it, the whole beginning, middle, and flow of the story was actually a lot smoother in the second read, where I kind of knew what was going to happen. Here are our basic plot point takeaways. Midas is super scheming, and he's not above using Oren as a pawn in his machinations to gain more power. Maybe at some point in time he loved Oren, maybe at some point in time he was a good guy, but you can see that Oren has been sort of like in a daze. She's been using like drugs and other kinds of things to sort of keep herself in this more docile, calm mindset. For the first time in over a decade, she's separated from Midas after a traumatic event that Midas orchestrated, and she's sort of starting to come out of her shell and find herself again, find her place in the world, and start appreciating things that previously used to really scare her and take her out of her comfort zone. She's also kidnapped in her journey to meet Midas in another kingdom, and we're introduced to this Fae commander, who's very interesting in this book one, but it's too early for us to tell if he's going to be a good guy or a bad guy or just like a different guy. So book 2 is Glint. It's sitting with a 4.2 star rating. It has 38,634 ratings and 2,984 reviews. It's still pretty highly rated. It still has a lot of ratings and reviews, but like with most series, the number's gone down a little bit. As far as like booktubers I know or follow, I haven't seen anyone talk about this book, and I'm not seeing any reviews here on Goodreads from any of them. In Amazon, category-wise, we're looking at Greco-Roman myth and legend fantasy ebooks, mythology and folktales books, and fairy tale fantasy. So it mixes it up a little. These categories are still all really appropriate and applicable as far as I'm concerned. And to me, book 2, Glint, is where things really start to take off, and I start to like be really interested and invested in some of the characters. Book 2 also sort of spreads out the first-person narrative. In book 1, almost everything is told from Oren's perspective, and in book 2, we start to get a little bit of the Ice Queen Manila's perspective, a little bit of Midas's perspective too, back and forth. All three of them are physically in different locations besides having different goals, so they're telling us about what's going on in different physical locations in the world, so we can sort of like keep up to date in the whole kingdoms. I didn't really care for Manila's part of the story when I first read this series, and I kind of skimmed it. In the reread, I skipped it entirely. I just hated it. One of the things that has happened in this series that I don't really care for, and it's a byproduct of the world itself, but like almost everybody is horrible. Oren obviously is a very good person. She's compassionate and she's loyal. As far as a male to female ratio on it goes, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 male characters who are pretty good / decent. And we have Oren and one other female character who is okay. Now, there are more male characters than female characters in the story as a whole, but it's really upsetting to see so many women just be horrible monsters and treat each other badly all the time and tear each other down. I don't necessarily find it believable or realistic. Like, I get that Manila, who is the queen that's been married to Midas, is bitter and angry and upset, but she is so disconnected from the real world, and she treats everyone so terribly. Like, instead of her abuse and her like being rejected and kind of pushed aside because she wasn't considered to have worth for various reasons, instead of that, like giving her perspective and seeing like that other people who have been set aside because they don't have worth for other equally arbitrary reasons, or seeing that like her husband treating people like tools is going to lead to his downfall, or her husband doing these horrible things is part of what she could use as leverage to make him unpopular. She does almost exactly the same things that he is doing in less likable ways. She was like,
I'm gonna create a revolt while he's away in another kingdom. I'm gonna get all the nobles on my side, and we're gonna reject Midas's ways.
And Midas is doing a lot of things wrong in the kingdom. Like, he has all this gold and riches and finery, and he has like this zero tolerance, killing everybody kind of policy. And she could give away the gold, or she could spread the wealth out in a way, or use that wealth to create initiatives that would lead to better results for her people. She could have like organically taken control back from him and declared that her kingdom was like the first kingdom that was going to have a magic-free ruler, that people without magic, who are the majority in this world, have the same kind of value and power and right to a say in how their world works that people with magic have. But instead, she like forces the nobles to go her way and treats them terribly and like garbage the whole time. Like, what incentive do they have to continue to be loyal to her and to revolt against Midas when Midas is like offering them money and power? And like the poor people, she like shows that she's like openly disgusted against them and that they're just a tool for her to use in her game against Midas. So they're not on her side either. So I don't know how she thought she was going to do this. And she's just so mean and unlikable. I hate her chapters. I hate reading about her. I kind of hope she dies. And I feel really bad for people who remain loyal to her. I don't know why they do it, and I wish that they had more self-esteem. Meanwhile, when we go back to Oren's story, where she's trekking with the commander, they're kind of like attracted to, she's kind of learning to fight a little bit. She's learning more about herself and like being comfortable in her own skin and all those kind of things. She's also still trying to reach out to the other saddles, and they're just horrible to her. And I don't really understand this either, because she stood up for them on multiple occasions. She's gotten things for them that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and they just hate her. I don't get it, even if it was only a temporary alliance kind of thing. And we're talking about people who are forced into sex work they don't want to do, and they sort of have like a found family alliance vibe within their own self. They sort of understand about performing versus their real selves and protecting and all these other kinds of things that are interesting to explore, but they don't ever extend that to Oren, and I don't know why, especially when she's being nice to them and reaching out to them and helping them. Like, it just kind of makes them seem horrible and bratty, and it's sort of like it pulls against other elements of their characterization. Like, if they're good at this performance, they're good at adapting to survive and survive in the best quality of life possible for them, then why aren't they capable of extending that to Oren and like befriending her, or accepting that maybe their presumptions about her aren't correct, or even if what they think about her is true within the castle, they're in a new setting, in a new reality now. It felt like there was antagonism there just to force Oren into a certain kind of path. It didn't make sense for the Saddles characters to interact that way. The whole thing, it was even more frustrating on a second read. Some of the interaction between her and the commander Rip is a little bit unsatisfying, and I thought this second read through I would like pay close attention, because there's a couple of reveals in book 3, and I was like,
now that I know those reveals, I'm going to look for it here in book 2, and some of the things that he's saying and doing that don't make sense are going to come together and make sense now.
Nah, there are still moments where it feels like Rip is acting cryptically or antagonistically or mean just to continue to confuse Oren, which doesn't like help his overall goals. It's just another plot device to keep us like in this mind working area. And I enjoy like thinking about it and trying to figure it out, and like I love solving puzzles, so I enjoy that in and of itself. But it just is a little bit disappointing that it doesn't have a larger goal in the story, or that it doesn't pull together story-wise to be telling me something about these characters, as well as like keeping my mind engaged figuring it out. The trigger warnings in book 2 and 3 do not get better, they just get worse. So if you did find book 1 upsetting, I would not continue with this series. But overall, I really enjoy Glint. I do love the chemistry that's starting to develop between Oren and Rip. There's some parts of it that I don't like, because a little bit it feels like Oren is always following a man around, or like Oren can only stand on her own if there's someone else there to help shelter and protect her. And the book does a pretty good job, both in 2 and 3, sort of addressing this and trying to dispel that. And also, like, I don't think whether you need help or not to get out of a bad situation invalidates somebody leaving a bad situation. Like, if you could do it on your own, then a lot more people probably would move themselves out of things that they're unhappy with in their life. So like showing that you can accept help and lean on other people and learn to trust them. And that doesn't mean that you're beholden to them or you belong to them or that's your only situation in life. It's kind of like a valuable and interesting thing to bring to a story like this. There's a ton of Fae lore in here. Some basic plot points to take away from this story. Oren's become more independent. She is going to go back to Midas, but things have to change between her and Midas for her to stay. Immediately where we as readers know the tension is going to be in book 3. So it does a great job setting up what the problem is going to be in book 3. We also get to see Oren sort of gaining strength, doing like some satisfying training montages. There's an interesting side plot going on with one of the saddles who's pregnant with Midas's baby. And there's another interesting side plot going on where Oren did manage a kind of sort of truce / alliance with Riza, one of the other saddles, and Riza is planning to try and like escape her life as a saddle. We also got to know Rip and some of the characters around him, so like he's like this interesting, powerful Fae who seems to like have it all put together. He can control his Fae magic, he's got like a whole army following him, he has a loyal inner circle that he shares all his secrets with. He's got like pretty much everything Oren wants in life, and it's interesting to see him interact with it and sort of like suggest that she could have these things too if she would just free herself from Midas's shadow. So that moves us into book 3, Gleam, where Oren goes back to King Midas, finds out that it's not as easy as she thought it was going to be to change things between her and him, and that maybe what she thought was going on relationship-wise between her and him is not how she originally perceived it. This is the 3rd book in the Plated Prisoner series. It's significantly longer than any of the others. I'm assuming book 4 is going to be even longer because it was originally set up to release in May, and now it's not releasing until June. This book's perspective is split up even more than the first 2 were. We get a ton more Manila scenes. I skipped all of them. I hate Manila. I don't care what's going on in High Bell. I'm not gonna lie. We get more Midas scenes. I actually found them to be a little bit confusing given the reveal that happens at the end. I kind of get the feeling in the reread of book 3 here that this story was loosely planned out before Raven Kenndey wrote it, but not 100% fleshed out. And like some of the things happening in book 3, even within the text of the book itself, are being retconned. Particularly Midas's character. We got a chapter from him in book 2 that implied certain things to me about him, and a chapter I think in book 1 as well, where I was thinking like,
this guy's like casually abusive.
It's not right what he's doing, but it's not on purpose. Like, he's not intentionally trying to manipulate Oren or abuse Oren. He really does think he's doing the best thing for her. It's sort of interesting to talk about how you could be like abusive through negligence, or how a person could be thinking they're doing the best for somebody else, but because they're not listening to them, they're actually damaging them. You know, like that's a compelling and interesting story, but that's not the story that's happening, guys. Book 3, Gleam, is where we get that reveal. And it just feels like those previous chapters, it's like,
what was the point of those perspectives from Midas?
I don't think his other perspective chapters should have gone the way they did if this over here is who he really is. And even like in book 3, Gleam, we're getting these chapters where Midas is slowly getting like darker and darker and meaner and meaner. And maybe the chapters are meant to echo the same way that you like slowly fall into an abusive relationship where you start out with like,
he's doing some shitty things, but it's not really his fault.
Into like,
no, he's intentionally just being awful and hurting people.
Like maybe it was supposed to mimic that, but because we can hear Midas's inner monologue and his thoughts and his feelings, and in fact most of Midas's chapters are all about what he's thinking and feeling. It's not really driving anything forward plot-wise. When you get to the end of the book 3 reveal, you end up thinking like,
doesn't feel like an authentic voice anymore.
from his perspective. It feels like another chapter dropped in with a perspective that's slightly different than Oren's, and it's there to intentionally mislead readers, which is okay. It's okay to intentionally mislead your readers. The problem is that Midas's characterization was sacrificed to do it. Like, I don't think that it's a fun misdirect. I think it's like a misunderstanding of how a character like this would think and feel and react. Gleam is sitting at a 4.5 star rating. It has 35,738 ratings and 3,497 reviews. So you can see by the time you get to book 3 and you get to this longer book, only people who are loving the series are sticking with it. And we're rating it super high. This book is under Greek and Roman myth and legend, sword and sorcery fantasy, and mythology and folktales. Again, all these are fitting together. Gleam is very action heavy. We have like what Oren is trying to do, what the Fourth Kingdom's trying to do. We get an introduction to Queen Calla in the Third Kingdom. I like the addition of Queen Calla a lot. On the reread, I found her even more interesting and fun to read about. Her magic, she can control voices, so she can like bring whispered secrets from across the room to her ears. She can create a zone around her that's private that no one else can hear about. She can silence people when she doesn't like what they're saying. Like, she just can do a lot of cool things with her powers, and it seems like it would be really tricky and hard to get around. It was nice to have a woman who was in it for herself and her kingdom and was just honest about who she was, what she was doing, what her motivations were. And even though she wasn't acting in like a way that was necessarily good, I could see why she was doing it for her kingdom. Like, sacrificing 1 or 2 people so that her whole kingdom could thrive or so she could come out on top made sense in her mind. Again, not necessarily moral, but it was something where I was like,
yeah, I can understand why you're doing that and get behind you.
She has all these fun dramatic scenes. She has all these plots. You look at her and you think like,
oh my goodness, I think she could do plot circles around Midas, who up until now has been the most conniving of the characters.
So I was just really down with her character, and I was actually really excited to see her get one over on Midas, and I'm kind of a little disappointed we don't get to see that here in this 3rd book. Major spoilers here. Oren ends up harnessing all of her magic and getting all the gold that she's touched to move and kill a whole bunch of people, including King Midas. But I think King Midas might not be dead. We see either at the very end of book 2 or the very beginning of book 3 that Rip can rot people, and in a limited amount of time he can actually bring them back from the dead. So it's possible that Oren can gold touch people and bring them back. Or like in the case where at the end of this scene, Oren's magic just completely loses control. Maybe it loses control and totally wears off, and Midas gets like ungold touched and is like kind of wandering around in the background. So I think that's like a possible plot point. We've got this town that Rip wanted for whatever reasons, and it has something to do with him and his origin, or like maybe a potential weakness he has, or maybe a way into the fairy realm that we don't know about. But I think here in book 4 we're going to get to find out more about that like specific town, why Rip wanted it. It didn't escape my notice that in book 3 Oren bears it all. She tells everything to the readers and to Rip, but Rip doesn't really tell us anything about himself. There's not an equal exchange there, and that guy's got a ton of secrets. Looking at this, book 4 is probably going to be about Rip's secrets and about secrets surrounding the realm of Aurea as a whole, and maybe about how Aurea interacts with the fairy realm, because we started to like get this understanding that 2 used to be joined, and for whatever reasons they're not anymore, or if they are joined, it's not in such a way that there's easy crossover or flow between the 2 worlds anymore. And one more quick note I want to mention on our wrap up is that the formatting in these books is excellent. All of these books are on Kindle Unlimited, and usually I talk to you guys about how there's like a lot of grammar and spelling issues, how there could have been like a use of a copy editor or a developmental editor or some other formatter involved. That is not the case with Raven Kennedy's work. She has beautiful formatting. At the beginning of every chapter, she tells you whose perspective you're reading, and she actually has a symbol to go with them. So like with Oren, she starts out with a cage, and then she eventually ends up being like a songbird, and it's really pretty and like a nice simple silhouette. Midas has a key that's probably golden, but it makes sense because he's always like keeping Orin under lock and key, and he's always locking down and separating different elements of the story. Manila gets a bell, which makes sense because she's the queen of High Bell, and they talk about how that bell rings to warn about storms and stuff. And then Rip slash Slade slash King Rot gets like this spiky branch, which also sort of fits with his power very loosely. But one of his forms has spikes, and he's got like a natural earthy smell or whatever, so I sort of see why we like translated that into Briars on the page. Also, all the cover designs on these books are phenomenal. I know that book 1 got a major cover overhaul, and it's really, the new one is beautiful with like the golden bars. And I think this is like the kind of story that does well with symbols instead of people on the covers, because Orin herself is a gold person with like ribbons coming out of her back and stuff. I just don't think that like drawing that would have been helpful. And like, I don't know what kind of pose you would have put her in. All of it's better if you just leave it to my imagination and you just sort of like suggest things for me using simple colors on the cover and like that gold gleam coming in and out. I just can't wait to see where we go next, and I'm really excited to read Glow. So have you guys read the Plated Prisoner series? And if so, did you like it or dislike it? Let me know in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading. Bye!